And he said, Tim, he said, you're going to have to tell Kath this. And I said, dude, if I tell her this stuff, I'm going to lose her. And he said, well, if you don't tell her, you're going to lose yourself.
Welcome to another edition of Inspiring Courageous Faith, and I've got something to show you that has incredible history behind it. Can you see this? There are hundreds of letters in a file from about 18 to 24 months of letters that I received when I had a daily radio program and I did a broadcast on infidelity. And it was like we touched a major nerve in the stories of people writing. I think it would make a great book just to publish the consequences of what happens when one spouse or both makes an error and is not faithful to the vows that they committed to. Little did I realize that it would be some 20 years later that I would run into a couple on Family Life's Love Like You Mean It cruise, who came up to me as I walked out of an elevator. I had a birthday cake because it was my birthday, and they ran into me and were helping me celebrate. I didn't know who they were, but it was a couple that are with us right now, Tim and Kathy Bush. Welcome to Inspiring Courageous Faith.
Hi, Dennis. Thanks for having us.
Hi, Dennis.
You know, they look nice and sweet and everything here, but you're going to hear a story that'll rock you. This is an incredible story of God's power working to redeem two people and a marriage and a mission. And it's really an exciting story to tell. Tim and Kathy Bush have been married since 1982. They have 3 children who are married, 8 grandchildren. They are the founders of the War Room, and they host marriage and family conferences all over the country and have impacted in the thousands of married couples out of this story that they have to tell. They have written a book, and it's going to be kind of startling to you as a viewer, I think, but it's called Sex on the First Date. And that's really not what this is about. It's about how a marriage started and had a rocky beginning, but it ends up being quite a story of God's redeeming grace. And one of your chapters that really got my attention, Tim, Kathy, was the chapter entitled Caught. You want to share with us a little the story of what took place several years into your marriage, of what happened and who got caught?
Well, Dennis, that was about the 25-year mark in our marriage. And at that point, we'd been through a lot, and we had decided that we were going to reconcile our marriage. And I'd built this big, brand new, beautiful house for Kath on the water with every amenity possible, everything she wanted. And I thought we were just really good, really happy and doing well. And that day I left the house, and I just didn't feel like I did a proper goodbye, meaning I didn't give her a good enough kiss or whatever. I felt really close to her. And so I pulled out of the garage, and I felt an inkling to pull back in. So I pulled back in and started to walk in the house. And as I was walking up the stairs, we had carpeted stairs, I was very quiet, and I heard Kath talking, and I realized as the closer I got that she wasn't talking to her mom or one of her sisters, that she was actually talking to a dude. And then as I listened quietly, I realized it was a guy that she had had an affair with before. And the things I heard, I was just in disbelief. So what I had thought leaving the house was really not what was happening at all. And so it was really scary for me. At that point, I thought, there is absolutely no way I can stay in this marriage. And I thought it was God's way of getting back at me. And I thought, we just need to get a divorce and start over, because this just isn't going to work.
Well, It has been said that the beginning of a story can't predict the end of a story. And I want to take you all the way back to the homes you guys came from and the families you were raised in and all those who were a part of helping you create your picture of what marriage ought to be. You remember that?
Yeah. Yes. So for me, Dennis, I was raised in a family with 7 children. I was the very middle child. My dad was an immigration officer, and we traveled around about every 2 to 3 years. He would get a promotion and we would travel around. My parents were long-term married. So I feel like I was really raised in a pretty strong, I feel like I got a strong foundation from my family. We did go to church on Sundays, and, I saw a good marriage with my parents. I really didn't see my parents fight. My dad was home for dinner every night. My mom raised all the kids. I was kind of raised in a way that you were going to you weren't going to go to college. You were going to find a man and you were going to get married. And that's kind of what I thought as I was growing up, when I turned 18 and graduated, that I would find a man and get married. And, there was definitely dysfunction in our home. There was probably a lot of things I didn't know about, but there was things that went on. And I ended up between 11 and 12 years old being molested. And I think that changed a lot of my life. I was pretty shy, and I became even more introverted and depressed, and I really didn't have any friends. I hated school. And then when I got into middle school, I started drinking a lot. And I think that drinking gave me courage, and I became pretty promiscuous from that time on. And so, had, I think, a good foundation, but some things definitely went awry in the family.
When we get married, we don't really take into account all of what has made our spouse the person that they are. And there's a lot of baggage. There's a lot of closets. There's a lot of things hidden. There's a lot of things that aren't hidden. But those things all have a huge impact on who we are as husbands and wives. Tim, what about you? What was your home like?
Well, Dennis, for me, quite different. No church foundation whatsoever. I don't ever remember going to church unless it was a funeral or somebody getting married. My mom was married 9 times. My dad was 5, and then at age 12, my mom was going to marry a guy that didn't want to have any kids, so she gave me up for adoption. And so my grandparents adopted me, and that's how I got the last name Bush. And I felt like they had a solid marriage, but at age 18, because of infidelity, they got a divorce. My pop was cheating on my grandma, and I can tell you that that's what I thought was the norm. I didn't know many guys that didn't cheat on their wives. I thought that's what guys did, and they just didn't talk about it. And as I think about it, as I got older too, I had a very influential man in my life tell me that you take those kind of things to your grave. So I just never did talk about it. And so I can say that I was attracted to Cass' family because they were a church-going family and long-term married. And I thought because of the family and the church, that could change me. But I also wanted to, I was a guy that liked women, and I liked beautiful women. And Cass was a beautiful young woman. But I could also look at her mom, who was 20 years her senior, and see what she was going to look like 20 years later. And that's kind of how shallow I was. I thought if I was going to be stuck with one woman, I wanted her to be beautiful and really good looking. So that was important to me. So that's kind of how I looked at it back then. So I didn't really know any other, as far as marriage, I didn't really have a real good example to teach me anything different.
The interesting thing about that first chapter, you share that you had caught Kathy, but that you, Tim, were living a lie as her husband.
Oh, I'd been living a lie the whole 25 years, even from before we were married. I had done lots of things I never told Kath. And I just thought that's kind of what guys did. And women had a different standard than guys. And I didn't know too many guys that didn't do those things. And so I just thought it was pretty normal, and you just don't talk about it. And in fact, I was told by a person I really respected, you take these things to the grave, you never talk about them. And he was an older man, and he had an influence on my life.
You know, I've thought back about you guys many, many times. This really was like a giant roller coaster from how you started your marriage all the way up to year 25 when you discovered that she was having an affair too. You were controlling husband, Tim, and that completely squelched Kathy. Kathy, was that a part of what you were looking for when you reached out outside your marriage to other men?
Oh yeah, when I don't think I really realized how controlling Tim was until I would step out of the marriage and be with other men and see that, you know, everyone wasn't like Tim. And when I look back at the control, it was, and I realized where it came from and how Tim was raised. But on the other hand, a lot of it I allowed because I didn't know any different. And, you know, I was 18 when we got married. And my biggest thing when I married Tim was I felt like he was going to protect me and take care of me. And even through everything that went on in our marriage, I always felt like he did that for me. And, but the control was definitely an unhealthy thing, but it was something that I also allowed because I didn't know what to do to change it. And I think part of me too was I went from my mom and dad to Tim, and I stepped in. I missed that growing up stage. So I stepped, you know, from being a child to continuing to be a child. And so a lot of the way I felt Tim treated me was kind of like a dad, but I, in my mind, thought this is how I need to be because he's making all the money. He's taking care of me. You know, I felt like I owed that to him because I was not in a healthy place.
Describe that control. What are you talking about when you say he controlled you?
For instance, he had the checkbook. He controlled the money. He would give me a certain amount of money, like an allowance.
I called it an allowance. How good is that?
Yeah, he did. He called it an allowance. But this is what his parents did for him. And so, you know, I was like, okay with it. And I felt like, like to go do the grocery shopping. I remember there's a chapter in the book I write about the first time I did the grocery shopping. And I remember I made a whole list and I did meal prepping, and it took me hours to do this list. And I went to the grocery store for the very first time. Tim gave me the checkbook. This was like a big deal because he had always done the grocery shopping. And I spent a couple hours in the grocery store. I put had the bag boy put the groceries in the back of my ranchero. And I ran into the store next door to get my birth control pills. And I came out and the groceries were all gone. And I got in that car and I cried. But the feeling I was feeling was I was in trouble. Like Tim was going to be mad at me because he gave me this chance to go grocery shopping and he was going to be mad at me. So that's where our relationship was.
Wow.
But I didn't get mad.
He didn't get mad. No, he felt really bad for me.
I did.
Yeah.
You know, I think back on just the crisis, again, how you started your marriage. And that wasn't all that was going on, just infidelity, but there was also a lot of alcohol and drugs and staying out late all night. Tim, you were, and then together as a couple, you did that, partying. I don't think we realize today how much this is contributing to the destruction of marriages and families. Would you agree?
Absolutely.
Oh,
I think it's a huge part of the destruction in marriage and family. And they're also modeling that to their kids, where kids want to grow up someday and be like their parents who are partying and doing drugs and having fun in their eyes. And that's not a good way to raise the next generation.
So what kind of drugs were you doing, Tim?
Well, in my heyday, meaning when I finally OD'd, I was doing cocaine and speed to keep going. And I was close to 300 pounds. So I was and drinking a lot. So and that's what when I OD'd on the cocaine, I never did cocaine again, but I still did some drugs, but not so much till I had my meltdown later on when I got brought to my knees. And I did prescription drugs then, more Xanax and alcohol and things to keep me from losing it.
Tell our viewers what happened on that day you OD'd.
What happened when you overdosed?
When I overdosed, Dennis, we were on the Oregon coast. It was for Kath's birthday. And I was 26, I believe. Kath was a couple years younger than me, so it was her 24th birthday. And I had got what they called an 8-ball of cocaine. And we had a new car. And we went to the Oregon coast and had some weed and had a case of Asti Spumante. And we drank basically the whole case. And we also went to Moe's and had clam chowder and hors d'oeuvres and drinks. And then around 11 o'clock at night, I told Kath, I said, I feel like my heart's racing. There's something wrong. And
you were how old?
And so go ahead, Dennis.
You were how old?
I was 26. And I told Kath, I said, I feel like my heart's racing. I can't come down. So I got in the shower and took a shower, and that didn't work. And then I went outside on the deck. That didn't work. And I said, you know what? I'm going to take a bong hit of weed, and that'll bring me down. And it did just exactly the opposite. So I started feeling so sick and anxious that I thought I was going to die. So I started to tell Kath, we had 3 little kids at home, and I started at her parents, and I said, you know, Kath, you need to tell your mom and dad this, our kids that. I had all these, because I'm going to die. I really thought I was going to. And so finally, about 2 o'clock in the morning, down at Lincoln City, Oregon, I said, we got to go to the hospital. So we got in the car, and I wanted Kath to drive. And of course, she's a little bitty thing, and she's high too on cocaine and alcohol. And her eyes were just spinning. I looked over and I realized I had to pull her out from behind the wheel. I had to drive. So I got in the car, had no idea where the hospital was. And 2 o'clock in the morning, no clue whatsoever, and found an H. And so I went to where the H was, the blue H, went to the hospital, walked in and said, hey, I've never done this before, but somebody on the street was selling something called cocaine, and I tried it, and I think I'm overdosing. So I totally lied. And they laid me, I got in the hospital, and I had 161 heart rate laying down. And I think I was real close to having a blowout, having a heart attack.
And so, Kathy, what were you thinking at that point?
Well, you know, Tim, when he was taking a shower, he was trying to get himself together. I remember him taking a shower, and he's telling me everything that I need to tell the kids and everything I need to tell our friends and parents, because he didn't want to look like the bad guy. And he's telling me like what to do with our money. And like, even in this moment of he's near death, I remember thinking he's still like trying to control everything. Like he's wanting to know that I'm going to do these exact things if something happens to him. And I remember getting in the car, and I thought, there's no way I can drive. I'm messed up myself, and I have no idea where I'm going. And I remember when he was in the hospital, and I'm sitting in the waiting room, and I don't even know what to do. I don't know what's happening back there. And I feel like this child, like I'm afraid to go to ask anybody anything. All these things are going through my mind. And, you know, there was a lot of times in our marriage and that control that Tim had on me. I remember asking God, like, to take my husband, like death is the only way out of this control. And I don't remember that night thinking that I wished he died, because I was really scared for him. And we were kind of at a place that this possibly could happen. But I was so afraid because I was so immature, and I didn't, I knew if something happened to Tim, I'm thinking, I don't even really know where I'm at. I so depended on him. I was so dependent on him, and I just didn't know, if something happened to him, what I was going to do. That's pretty much where my mind was on that.
During all this, you guys would call yourself churchgoers, right?
Yep.
1.3 times a month, Dennis, 12 times a year, and Christmas and Easter.
We were doing what I thought we should do, because that's how I was raised. And I think my parents took us to church more than that. But especially once we started having kids, we wanted to take our kids to church, get them in Sunday school.
Sure.
Because that looked good. That was the right thing to do. So yeah, we would have said we were Christians. And I mean, we were definitely Christians.
How did you
said
justify that? I mean,
We justified.
yeah, go ahead.
And honestly, Dennis, I can say that I thought I was a Christian. I mean, I knew I was going to go to heaven. That's what I thought. And Tim said, he believed in God, so I figured we were going to go to heaven.
And I was making deals with God all the time. I just didn't realize he didn't make deals. So I thought I was, though. I was, I'm going to go to church, but that's going to erase what I did last night, right, God? You good with that? And so that was how I talked to God.
But the Lutheran church we went to, we didn't really hear anything different. We just didn't hear anything different.
We watched the clock. I knew that once it was over at noon, I needed to get out of there and go watch a football game or something else. When I was not engaged. I handed out business cards at church.
Was not making an impact on your life.
Right.
Definitely.
Right.
So how long before Tim came clean, and what was going on in his life?
Well, I knew a couple things Tim had told me about through these years. A couple of instances with infidelity. I did not know the extreme of it, and it took. So this was 25 years of marriage. It took till year 27.
Yeah.
It was 2 more years. In that conversation, when I felt like it was our rock bottom, really my rock bottom. And I begged him to stay and not leave because he was headed out the door. And he sat down, and I told him about some counselors that our daughter had actually been going to, the wife she had been going to. And I knew they were marriage counselors. And I said, I will get a hold of them right away and see if we can get in. And we committed to counseling with them. And I would go to the wife and Tim would go to the husband. And then we would come together, the 4 of us. And this started a journey of 2 years of intensive counseling with Tim and I. And so we started working through things. And what's interesting, in those 2 years of counseling, Tim did not disclose everything. So Tim did not disclose everything until, I think it was probably, because I actually finished counseling. I thought we were in a good place. And I told Tim, I don't think I need to go see Jennifer anymore. I think that we've kind of worked through everything we can work through. But things started getting bad with Tim at this point.
What do you mean by that?
We had a couple events. Let's see. It was October 13th of 2008. 2008. My sister's son, our nephew, shot and killed himself. And he was our son's best friend. He grew up with our kids. And so this was
22.
He was 22 years old. He was married. He had a young daughter. And this started, it was just really hard on the family. It was really hard on our kids. And then Tim's brother, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, he was diagnosed in that same year, just a few months before Luke's death, with stage 4 glioblastoma. And then in 2008, after he was diagnosed and after Luke passed away, the economy kind of changed. And I was building my own kingdom here on earth and had several loans, and the bank that I was dealing with went into receivership. So then there was a point in time towards the end of 2008, all I could do was think about death and debt. I could not sleep. I was a mess.
You actually thought about taking your own life too, right?
I definitely did, Dennis. I was thinking about it, planning it even.
Let me go back a little bit, Dennis, because during this time after when I had finished counseling, Tim continued counseling because he started dealing with some things, these other things. So he started having anxiety, and then that moved into depression, and that and I think when his brother was diagnosed with cancer, that was really in Tim's face that he could not fix his brother. And he could not control that, because here's the thing, even though we were in counseling for 2 years, we still didn't know Jesus. We still didn't, this was kind of a temporary fix. And I felt like we had actually worked through everything in our marriage. So when Tim started having all these symptoms of anxiety and depression, and Jake kept digging into Tim and said, yeah, like Tim said, maybe it's your abuse with your dad. And he went through a process with that. And finally, Jake looked at Tim and said, is there something you're not telling me?
And that's when I told Jake, I said, well, there is one thing. And he said, well, tell me about it.
Wow.
And I told him about the infidelity. He actually had a client after me. He actually canceled that client to have me keep talking. And I talked to him for well over an hour about all the different things that I had done. And he said, Tim, he said, you're going to have to tell Kath this. And I said, dude, if I tell her this stuff, I'm going to lose her. And he said, well, if you don't tell her, you're going to lose yourself. You're to the point now where God's basically got you on your knees and he ain't going to let you up. And so that was good advice. And I wasn't sure I was going to do it, but I did go home and tell Kath everything. And
Well, wait a second. How did you do that?
Well, I went home
Because you had confronted Kathy with her infidelity,
mm-hmm.
and now you're coming clean, talking about not just one infidelity, but multiple, right?
Well, I had been so sick, Dennis, and I just didn't know what to do. I was so sick, I couldn't work. I went over a year without working. And that's not like me, my 18-hour-a-day work schedule. And I just couldn't bring anything to the table anymore. I just didn't have any real reasons to live anymore in my mind. And so when Jake said I needed to do that, I really thought about it. I thought, maybe this is what I need to do. And worst case scenario, I can start over, I guess. And so I went home and I said to Kath, I said, I need to talk to you. And what I'm going to tell you is going to hurt.
Hold it. One quick question with Kathy. What did you think was coming, Kathy?
When I think back on it, I think I was just kind of waiting to hear what happened in his counseling appointment. So I don't really think I had any preconceived notions of what he was going to say, because he was going weekly and we would talk about his appointments. So I really wasn't thinking about I didn't know what he was going to tell me, but I wasn't really thinking about what he was going to tell me. I was just kind of open to, he was so sick, Dennis. I mean, he wasn't sleeping. He'd be in bed all day. I had a business at this time, and he would show up in the waiting room when I would get done with a client. I'd walk out of the waiting room and Tim would be standing there.
I was scared to be alone.
Our relationship had changed from him controlling me to I was really taking care of him because he was so sick. So my heart was different for Tim at this point. It was like, that's why I think God's timing in all of this. He was there with us every step of the way. Because if Tim would have told me this 2 years before in counseling, that, I don't know what I would have done. But Tim was so sick. I think that my heart was so big for him. When he told me everything, there wasn't one part of me that was wanting to run or leave the marriage, which is so different from all the years that had been before us. Because if he would have told me this before, I would have said, okay, I'm done. But I wasn't surprised. I wasn't shocked. I was definitely hurt, but I was really hurting for him. And I think the biggest thing I remember is thinking, I feel like now that everything's out on the table now, we can finally start building a marriage. There's not going to be any secrets between us, and we can finally start building a marriage. I think that's where my heart was after I processed everything he had told me.
And when I started telling Kath about the things, she kept saying, is that all? And Dennis, this lasted for a couple hours. There was ongoing, because I have a good memory, you know that about me, but it's also in some ways a curse too, because I did remember these things, and some of them were not just short things, some of them were decades long and still happening. And anyway, that's one of the first things Kath told me, was she wanted me to kill that relationship that had been going on for, at that point, over 27 years, off and on. And I made that phone call
Yeah, and he did that.
right in front of her.
He made that phone call right in front of me.
And I've never talked to that person since. Well, I shouldn't say that. Kath and I talked to her last summer. So we happened to be,
class reunion.
She was in line behind me, and it kind of worked out that way. And Kath afterwards said, "What were you thinking?" And I wasn't. That's the thing, I wasn't. But ultimately, then after I told her, I went to hug her, and she said, "Oh, no, don't hug me. But I'm not going anywhere." She did tell me that. And then I was still really sick. And a few weeks later, this was when I think really things started to turn, Dennis. A few weeks later, a family member came to Kath and also to come to see me. And I couldn't get out of bed, and told Kath, "Now's a good time for you to get out of the marriage." Tim's been manipulative, needy, all these things. And Kath told that family member, "I'm not going anywhere."
Wow.
And Kath came up and told me that, Dennis. And I look back at it, and I really do believe when Kath told me she wasn't going anywhere, I got that unconditional love that I didn't deserve. I really feel like through Kath, that's the first time I saw Jesus. And I didn't know that then, but I definitely know it now. And so she was just definitely my comforter. The Lord was using her to give me love I didn't deserve. It was amazing when I look back at it.
When I read that story, I had a couple of thoughts. One is how important friends can be for good or not so good, and advising you to go ahead and just divorce him. I think even within the Christian community, a community of faith in churches all over the country, when people hear the stories of what's taking place in a friend's marriage, and they hear of maybe abuse, infidelity, on and on it goes, they quickly want to release the pressure from that person. Just get out of here. Just divorce him, divorce her, and move on.
Yep.
And I think it's important what you just said, Tim. Her commitment back to you was a picture of the love of Christ. He gave you someone with flesh to see that for the first time in your life, and you received it. Mm-hmm. And you didn't run. You stayed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep, exactly. She stayed.
So at that, we
wouldn't be where we are today without that. That's for sure.
So at that point, was that the beginning of a spiritual renewal in your lives?
I think it might have been the spark, Dennis, but I think the real beginning was when we had gone to Mexico, and I was at really my low point then, where I was drinking a fifth a day vodka and taking Xanax and other drugs just to keep my anxiety down. And I remember getting in the first class seat in the airplane on the way to Mexico, and this is right after my brother died, and thinking things were going to be better. As soon as they closed the door, I was so claustrophobic I couldn't even have socks on my feet. I was literally I was just ready to melt down. And I went down to Mexico I was going to a board meeting, but I was going to get more drugs, because my doctor wasn't going to give me any more Xanax. And my friend was willing to get me Mexican Xanax. They call it Zantac, I guess. But he said, "Dude, I'll get you the drugs, but I want you to consider something, reading the Bible." And I said, "You know what? I bought a Bible, and I'm reading like 70 pages a night, whiskey in one hand, Bible in the other. I'm not getting anything from it." And he says, "Well, I don't know about how the whiskey's working," but he says, "Maybe you should slow down a little bit." And how I did it was I read a proverb a day, just one every day. There's 31, and maybe you should do that. Well, I didn't even know that the Proverbs were in the Bible at that point, but he told me they were. And so a couple weeks later, I asked Kath if she would read the Proverbs with me. And I believe that's the...
And I have to tell you, Dennis, when Tim asked me to read the Bible with him and start in Proverbs, I'll tell you that is like the sexiest thing that he had ever done. And I remember just thinking, wow, like I felt in my heart that, and I didn't know at the time, I know now, it's like that was the first godly way, the godly thing that Tim had done to lead me in our marriage. And that's when the big change happened, is we started reading a chapter of Proverbs every day. And we were blown away at what was in the Bible, because we'd never read the Bible before.
It's
I
called
remember,
wisdom.
yes,
Yeah, yeah,
but we
yeah.
had no idea.
Yeah, exactly.
We had no idea. Nobody had told us that.
And wisdom is skill in everyday living.
Yeah.
God wrote the book, the Bible. He's the one who created life, and he's the one who created marriage, and he's the one who can make it work. So did you get involved in a church at that point, a small group? Usually couples who have been in a crisis situation need to surround themselves.
Well,
And
Dennis, that journey was a funny journey. I had been in a grief counseling with the pastor that led my brother through his death. And he'd been a pastor for 40 years. And and he was willing to do it one-on-one with me. I get more detail in the book about it, but he, around the fourth time we met, he saw my anxiety was getting better, and he said, "Hey, I need to close the door because I need to have a conversation with you that's pretty important." He said, "Tim, I've been a pastor for 40 years. I'm an interim here, and I could lose my job for this, but I think this is from the Lord, and I want you to really listen." He said, "Tim, the Lord's got a calling on your life, and it's a big calling, and it's not here. You need to go find yourself a Jesus-loving, Bible-teaching church and figure out what that calling is." So I want you to know, Dennis, I was pretty excited about that, but I didn't know what a calling was. And I didn't know what a Jesus-loving, Bible-teaching church was either. So I went home because my church-going wife, I knew she would. She didn't know either.
When Tim told me that, I remember he's like, "Do you know what a calling is?" And I said, "No, but it sounds good."
And she said, "Let's find out."
And I said, I thought every church was a Jesus-loving, Bible-teaching church. That's interesting.
So the search went on, Dennis, and we started looking around for that church.
But one of the big things that happened, Dennis, after we had been in that counseling for 2 years, our counselors continued to tell us that we had a drinking problem. We were still drinking. We were slowing down at this time, but we were drinking a bottle of wine every night. And we started talking about it as we were reading the Bible. And we said, maybe our counselors have something. Maybe we should stop drinking.
Well, and the big tipping point was my 30th class reunion, where we literally almost passed out. I carried her back.
Well, we were going to quit drinking, but we had to go to the class reunion first because we didn't want to quit drinking before the class reunion.
I was class president. I was the life of the party. Yeah. The life had to go on.
Alcohol was a big part of our life. So after we quit drinking, we said we're going to do it for 1 month. And during this time of not drinking for 1 month and reading the Bible, that's when things really started to change.
Yeah.
And that's when we found a Jesus-loving, Bible-teaching church and just started going to that, started hearing things that we'd never heard before. We continued reading the Bible. We got through Proverbs. We went through Psalms. We started through the Gospels. We were reading the Bible every day, and things were changing. We were changing. And after that month of not drinking, we sat down and we wrote down a list of what was good about not drinking and what was bad.
Pros and cons. Ben Franklin clothes, I call it.
Yeah. And everything was good. So we said, let's do it another month. And every month we would reevaluate till about the 6th month, I think. And we decided we're just not going to have alcohol in our marriage. And we haven't drank since.
Yeah.
When did you turn over your lives and your marriage to Jesus Christ? Felt like you led us up to that point, and you're assuming we understand what you did. How did you surrender your lives to Jesus?
Well, it was a process. You want me to talk about the concert?
Yeah. So, well, let me talk first because, so during this, while we were reading the Bible, and, for Tim and I, it was completely different because I think me being raised in the church, I was a Lutheran. So, and with that, I thought I was a Christian. So as I'm reading the Bible and I'm not drinking, I'm starting to think different. I'm watching TBN all the time. Like every single day between my clients, I would turn on TBN and I would watch Joyce Myers and Charles Stanley and I'd hear different messages, and it was messages that I'd never heard before. And then after every time they would give their message, they would do the sinner's prayer. And so I would sit down and I would say the sinner's prayer. because I think there was, being raised in religion, there was like this block, like, okay, I think I'm a Christian, but I'm not sure. So I think for me, through reading God's word, that's when I surrendered my life to Christ. But I think there's that with religion, there's like this pride in you that says, I'm already a Christian, but my life didn't show any of that. So I realized the difference of what it was to truly surrender your life to the Lord and to not have your life surrendered to the Lord and just say you're a Christian. So I think that was the process for me. And then for Tim's, it looked a little different.
Yeah, for me, I've always been a musician, loved music, played several instruments, that kind of stuff, and just had a real ear for it and loved to sing too. And we had been to the Coliseum and saw a Kenny G concert, and I was still suffering anxiety in October. And then in November, the Jesus Loving Bible Teaching Church we were going to, they were going to have a Christmas concert, and they were going to take, God was there, but they weren't going to say it was a Christian deal. It was, they wanted everybody to come, and it was at a big Coliseum. And they actually wanted people to come serve. And I wasn't interested in serving at that point, but I said, you know what, we'll buy our tickets and pay a little extra, and that's how we'll be a part of it. So we go there, and we're at that deal the whole night, and the very last song was a song called The Lighthouse that I had never heard before in my life. And during that song, I felt this aha moment where I felt, and I know now it was the Holy Spirit coming inside me, and I felt this feeling that I'd never felt before. And I reached down to Kath and said, babe, our lives are going to change forever. We are going to serve the Lord.
And I knew when Tim looked at me and tears were coming out of his eyes, and he said that to me, and he says, we're going to serve the Lord. And I knew that was really that moment that I knew we're doing this. We're in this together, and we're surrendering our life to Christ.
And this was about a 1.5 year process for God was really breaking me down to my knees, to the point where I couldn't get up anymore, to the point where he was letting me up, but letting me know he was my spiritual daddy, and he had control. I had none, and he was going to help me be the man he wanted me to be. And I was going to be obedient the rest of my life, no matter what.
Well, as I'm listening to you talk about just this great story of redemption, your marriage was dead, was in the valley of the shadow of death at the least, but God rescued you. And I've often said God's power works greatest in a graveyard, where people die to themselves, they yield to Christ, and they give themselves to God and say, whatever you want, God, I'm yours. And I want to be about what you're about and be used by you. There's this one thing that I was wanting to talk to you about that I had to discuss with you, and that is, how did you rebuild trust in your relationship? You both confessed to multiple affairs, lots of reasons not to trust each other. And you didn't just flip a switch and all of a sudden trust showed up in your marriage and your family. How have you rebuilt trust? I just want you to unpack that a bit.
I think the biggest thing was being in God's word every day. And then a little bit while later, not too long after that, starting to pray together every day and inviting Christ in every day. But that was still a process. It didn't happen overnight, but it didn't take very long to rebuild the trust. Yet you'd still have issues of all of a sudden thinking about things that happened and other people, meaning, at least for me, maybe not so much for Kath, I would think about other men that she was with. It bothered me for a while, but I learned to capture those things and give them to the Lord and ask him to take them away from my mind and soften them. He didn't do it overnight, but you know, I have very, very vague memories of those things now where it doesn't come up. I can't even remember. It's been a long time, but Kath may think differently.
You know, and I do think differently, because I know there definitely for most couples, there needs to be that process of rebuilding trust. Now, for Tim and I do have to say it was a lot of supernatural help, because Dennis, when we truly submitted our life to Christ, we were radically transformed. And so when I think about those 27 years before, that is not the same husband that I am married to now. So the trust issues of anything I had with Tim before are completely gone, because he's not that man and I'm not the woman that I was. And, I think about my life verse is 2 Corinthians 5:17. Therefore, if any man is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old is gone and the new is here. And that's exactly what happened to Tim and I. When we submitted our life to the Lord, yes, there's that sanctification process, and we're going to go through that until death. But we were radically transformed. And so my thoughts of Tim, and, we were actually talking about that today, about are there any trust issues? Do we ever think about that? And there's just absolutely none. But we also are safeguarding our marriage every day.
We built some serious boundaries in our marriages that we don't cross over.
There you go. Now I want you to talk about those guardrails, because the Proverbs says, guard your hearts, for from it flow the life spring. It's from your heart. If you don't guard it, it can be polluted and can be heading in the wrong direction. What kind of guardrails do you have? Why don't you go first, Kathy?
Well, as far as, are you talking like practices that we have in our marriage? Like
non-negotiables.
Like, for instance, neither one of us ever go with the opposite sex to have coffee or lunch or
in the car.
That's it.
Yeah, in the car. We, that's never done. Our phones are completely open to each other. Computers. There's no secrets. There's no personal, like, if Tim is having, he obviously has conversations with men that I don't need to hear about and he doesn't need to share with me. But, and I think the main thing is we're in God's word every day, and we are praying together every day, and I don't feel like we've been in fellowship the last 15 days because we've been sick, but we stay in fellowship. And we stay serving, and we walk with the Lord. We're not perfect, but we know that we don't want to go back to the way we were. We never want to go back there. And so I think those are a lot of the things that we're doing.
We were at a family life getaway not too long ago, and there was a statistic we saw up on this, and I love the statistic. It says couples that pray together every day consistently have a 1 in 1,155 chance of getting a divorce. And I like those odds. So that's one of when we do our marriage events across the country, and what we hope we talked about in the book is that you need to pray together, and you got to figure it out, and you need to do it every day. And I know that I go with a group of guys, for example, on a pheasant hunt every year. I call my wife and pray with her on the phone every day. And it's just a non-negotiable for us. And we know we need that. And when you start feeling like you're doing it out of obedience for the Lord, it's pretty hard not to do it.
So this is pretty gritty, but I've got to ask it. So what happens when you feel a spark of attraction, Tim, to another woman?
Well, if I see something, for example, I'll tell Kath immediately. I'll say, look at this on my phone. And, or she'll say, what are you looking at? And I'll say, well, it just popped up right there. And so we're really open with each other like that. But, I got to tell you, Dennis, being a man and figuring out some of these things happened with a couple books. The first one was by Stephen Farrar, Point Man. And then I read your book, Stepping Up. And it's really the only book I've read 4 times. And it's because of the nuggets I got out of that book for being a man. I think it's, other than the Bible, it's just a really, really strong roadmap for guys to be the men that God wants them to be. And it's a process, and it's an everyday process. You have to die to yourself. You have to figure out ways to love your wife every day. And I fail. I don't always do the best. I'm a work in progress too. The goal is for her to feel loved and cared for and cherished every day. And like when she walks across the room, I told her this morning, I love it when you walk across the room. We've been married almost 43 years, and I love it more now than I did at 33 years. But you have to work on that, I think. You have to work on that. You have to have eyes, and that's an accountability too. I think men's accountability is real important in that, and having that question, how are your eyes with the guys, is pretty important. And I think any guy that's not in some kind of accountability, I think they need to be.
So, Kathy, how's Tim doing, really, in loving
He does
you?
amazing. He really does. He does amazing. And I think that when you said that, what do you do if there's any form of attraction, or I think the key is that you are always communicating with your spouse. And I think for Tim and I, remembering what happened before in our marriage and how those things happened, a lot of, I would say 95% of the time that we were both unfaithful, alcohol was involved. And that's why we have chose to not have alcohol in our marriage. And we're not, even having a glass of wine is not necessary for us. Life's too good. We just don't need to do that. And I think just truly communicating and not letting, if obviously, like I said, we're not perfect and we're going to have our disagreements and our fights here and there. But, our fights that we used to last for a week, and we wouldn't talk to each other. And now one of us is convicted probably within an hour that, hey, we need to apologize or we need to talk about this. Like, there's not even that thought of divorce, where that thought was always in my mind. It was like, eventually we're going to get a divorce. But now it's like, we know that we are committed. Like, we're not together because we love each other when we have that feeling, those feelings of love. I mean, I can say since I surrendered my life to Christ, I have never not loved my husband. But before, it was like I lived on my feelings. And if he was nice to me, then I loved him. And now it's just so different. Our marriage is so different. There's that commitment that we are here for the long haul.
It's Christ-centered. Everything we do is Christ-centered.
Yeah, it's Christ-centered.
Love is a commitment. You said it.
Right.
Love is a commitment.
Right.
It's actually a covenant. It's a promise.
Right.
And it's a promise you can take to your grave. Mm-hmm. Nobody does it perfectly. All right?
Nope.
Nobody does it perfectly.
I just want to, I want to summarize a very authentic discussion here and address the person who maybe has an affair that's going on right now. Maybe there's been an affair that was disclosed at the beginning of the podcast. I pulled out a file that has hundreds of letters in it of women and men who had their spouses come to them and confess to an affair. And they don't know what to do. The over and over it says, what do you do? How do you rebuild? What's the process? And there is no prescriptive process, A, B, C plus D, but there are some things I'd want to share with couples who do that. And I think you've illustrated most of these very, very well. The first one is just realize that your marriage came about as a result of a promise. And if you've broken that promise, ultimately you need to go to your spouse and confess that. I'll never forget a gentleman, very successful, top tier financially. And he admitted that he'd been unfaithful to his wife and he had never told her. And as I recall, they'd been married over 4 decades. And he, like you, Tim, you were afraid she would leave if you told her. But I talked with him about it, about not taking that secret to its grave, but disclosing it and then surrounding your marriage with help that can help you grow together as a couple. And what you guys have done a masterful job of is latching on to what God's call is, his mission for you as both individuals and as a couple. And I have to tell you, Kathy, you expressed concern before we came on the air that a couple of men who like to tell stories would dominate this podcast, and you wouldn't be able to get a word in edgewise. And I promise you, you've carried the day. You've taken care of Tim on that. But I want to give some, and I want to give some continued advice to that couple who are recovering from an affair. Just to assume nothing. Terminate that relationship, like Tim did with Kathy. Pick up the phone, make the call to the other person. It's over. No calls, no letters, no email, text, nothing. Terminate that relationship. And then the third thing I'd say is realize, as with any sin, there are consequences. And the consequences are real. One researcher, it doesn't sound like you guys suffer from this, but one researcher said in couples who'd been unfaithful, they have as many as 50 to 100 little twinges or flashbacks or reminders of those relationships in a day. And a lot of them have those reminders, and they're all, I think, bait in the water for the enemy to lure us away from our spouse. And start thinking about that and meditating on that. Let that go. And get busy rebuilding trust as you guys have. And I just write out your boundaries. And you guys have done that. You've talked a great deal about that. Write those boundaries out and then live by them. And if you do fail, as we all will fail in various ways, maybe hopefully only small ways, go and confess. Because with a confession, I think builds trust. Even if you are admitting to something that you've wronged the other spouse. And then finally, just continue on with what God's called you to do. That's been a theme of this podcast. And be courageous. One last question for you two. I'm sure I've asked it of Tim, but I don't know that I've asked it of Kathy. But I'll give you a moment to think about it, Kathy. But Tim's already heard it from me on a number of occasions. What is the most courageous thing you've ever done in all your life, Tim? Kathy, you can answer here in a minute. The most courageous thing you've ever done in all your life.
You want me to go first?
Yep.
Yeah. 'Cause I'm thinking about mine.
Kat's thinking, well, and you heard this, Dennis, but the most courageous thing I've ever done was when I told Kath about all my infidelity with the thought in my mind that I was going to lose her for sure and my life was going to change forever. And really everything that was important to me at that point, the only way I had to do was face it and have the opportunity to lose it. So that took a lot of courage. And so that would be it. That would be the most courageous thing.
Kathy?
Well, I would say that moment that very influential person said to me, this would be a good time to get out of your marriage. And I stood up to this person probably for the first time in my life and said, I'm not going anywhere and I'm staying with Tim and I'm going to make this marriage work. I think that's what comes to mind when I think about being courageous.
Thank you guys for spending these minutes, several of them, with us to share your story. And I just want to mention again your book, Sex on the First Date. It sounds kind of salacious, but it's not a salacious book. It just talks about how something started, and it's gotten much better than how it started, I promise you. I also want to thank you for your ministry, War Room Ministries, and help us out here on Inspiring Courageous Faith and hit the like button, pass it on to a friend, write a comment, share it. Just pass this on to people who may need it, because I know a lot of you know someone, if it's not you, who needs to listen to what's said here and hear Tim and Kathy's story. It's a story of hope and redemption. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you back here again soon for another episode of Inspiring Courageous Faith. May God bless you.
Go to therainies.org/podcast for more inspiring courageous faith content.